The billionaire CEO thought he left his past behind, until he saw a little girl with his eyes holding another man's hand. 4 years ago, Grayson Grant stood at the height of his career, having just secured one of the biggest deals of his life. His name was splashed across business magazines, and his face regularly appeared on financial networks. He was the kind of man who didn't stop moving, didn't look back, and didn't allow emotion to interfere with logic. His life was a calendar of boardroom meetings, investor calls, and cross-country flights. And then there was Rachel. She had walked into his life like a breath of fresh air, unexpected, genuine, and completely unlike anyone he had ever been with. She wasn't interested in his wealth or his influence. She was quiet but strong, full of passion for her art, her dreams, and her independence. For a time, they existed in a strange balance, his world of order and hers of creative chaos. They met in a coffee shop, where she had spilled her sketchbook on the floor and he had helped her gather it, not knowing that this 5-minute moment would become the start of something neither of them had planned. Over the course of a year, they grew close in a way that scared him. Rachel brought out a softness in him, asked questions that no one dared, and expected truth when he was used to giving half answers. And when she told him she loved him, something in him twisted. Not because he didn't feel it too, but because he did, and that was dangerous. Grayson had been raised to believe that emotion was weakness, that vulnerability was a flaw. So when his career demanded that he relocate to London for an extended project, he made a decision that would haunt him. He ended it with Rachel in a 3-line text message. No call. No explanation. Just a final goodbye disguised as practicality. He told himself it was cleaner that way, that she would move on, that it was for the best. Rachel sat on the floor of her small apartment for hours after that text, staring at it, unable to understand how something that had felt so real could disappear so easily. But then she felt the early symptoms, the nausea, the fatigue, and within a week, she knew. She was pregnant. She considered telling him. More than once, her finger hovered over his contact in her phone. But every time, she remembered how quickly he had walked away. She didn't want her child to grow up with someone who saw them as an obligation. So she made the choice to raise her baby alone. No drama. No court battles. Just quiet determination. That decision marked the end of her old life and the beginning of something far more difficult. She took freelance art gigs, worked nights teaching painting classes, and lived on coffee and sheer willpower. And when her daughter was born, a tiny girl with Grayson's blue eyes and blonde curls, Rachel named her Luna, after the moon that had kept her company on sleepless nights. In those early years, as she rocked Luna to sleep with lullabies and whispered promises, Rachel built a new kind of strength. One that didn't come from having everything under control, but from showing up every single day, no matter how tired, no matter how alone. Grayson faded into the past. Or at least, she thought he had. Because fate has a way of pulling unfinished stories back into the light, often when we least expect them. Rachel's days settled into a rhythm, the kind born from necessity rather than comfort. Mornings began before the sun, with Luna crawling into her bed and whispering for cereal and cartoons. Rachel would rub the sleep from her eyes, tie her hair into a loose bun, and carry Luna to the kitchen, where a single mug of coffee served as her armor for the day ahead. She didn't complain. She didn't have time to. Between painting commissions, part-time work at a local art supply store, and weekend lessons at the community center, Rachel's life was a delicate juggling act held together by love, exhaustion, and silent grit. Luna grew into a curious and joyful child, the kind who asked questions about everything and laughed with her whole body. She had inherited Grayson's ocean blue eyes and bright smile, but everything else was pure Rachel, the way she danced through puddles, her fascination with stars, the way she instinctively reached for her mother's hand even when she wasn't afraid. People often commented on how much Luna resembled Rachel's husband, and Rachel always just smiled and changed the subject. The truth was too complicated to explain in passing. She had stopped expecting anyone to understand. When Luna turned 2, Rachel met Mark Dillard. He came into her life like most people do when you're too tired to question motives, quietly, helpfully, conveniently. He was a friend of a friend, a man with a good job, steady routine, and a polite smile. At first, Rachel found comfort in his stability. Mark didn't ask too many questions about the past. He brought groceries when she was sick, fixed the leaky faucet in her bathroom, and offered to watch Luna during her weekend shifts. And for a while, she let herself believe that maybe this was what healing looked like, not fireworks, not passion, but peace. But peace, she learned, can be deceiving. Over time, Mark's helpfulness became control. He started questioning where she was, why she was late, who she was talking to. He criticized her parenting, made comments about Luna being too soft, too spoiled. He didn't hit. He didn't scream, at first. But his words were sharp, his tone icy, and his presence grew heavier with each passing month. Luna didn't like being alone with him, though she never said it directly. She clung to Rachel more, grew quieter, more withdrawn whenever Mark was around. Rachel noticed, but she pushed the thought aside, telling herself she was just imagining things. Still, something in her stayed alert. Some deep maternal instinct kept her from fully surrendering her trust. She told herself she was being smart, just careful. But the truth was, she didn't feel safe anymore. And that scared her more than she wanted to admit. Mark had never asked about Luna's father. He assumed, perhaps, that he had left, or had died, or had never mattered. Rachel never corrected him. There were some stories better left untold. But even as she tried to move forward, the ghost of Grayson lingered like a shadow behind her every choice. She wondered sometimes what he would say if he saw Luna now. If he'd regret leaving. If he'd even recognize the shape of her face or the sound of her laugh. Rachel didn't allow herself to think those thoughts often, because they didn't change anything. Grayson had made his choice, and she had made hers. What mattered now was keeping Luna happy, protected, and unaware of the heartbreak that had brought her into the world. Rachel painted at night when the apartment was silent, her fingers stained with color, her mind full of what if she would never say out loud. And then one ordinary Thursday afternoon, everything shifted. It began with a chance encounter in a crowded place and a single look that cracked open a past she thought was buried. What Rachel didn't know yet was that the story she thought had ended was only just beginning. It was supposed to be a normal day, another predictable stretch of hours filled with errands and noise, ending with Luna's favorite bedtime story and Rachel passing out with a brush still in her hand. They were at the airport that afternoon not to travel, but to pick up Rachel's friend who was returning from a short trip. Luna had insisted on wearing her favorite dress, the yellow one with tiny stars, and had braided her hair herself, which meant Rachel had spent 10 minutes trying to fix it without breaking her daughter's heart. Mark had come along, uninvited but insistent, his presence making the air around them feel a little too still, too sharp. He held Rachel's elbow just a little too tightly as they walked through the terminal, and his tone, while calm, had that edge she'd grown used to ignoring in public. They stood near a coffee kiosk when it happened. Rachel was kneeling to fix Luna's shoelace when Mark stepped aside to take a call. That's when she felt it, that peculiar awareness, the sense of being watched. She stood slowly and turned, and that's when she saw him. Grayson. He was standing across the terminal, holding a cup of coffee, frozen in place. His blonde hair was shorter now, and he was wearing a sharp gray coat over a suit, looking every bit the powerful executive the world saw him as. But his face had gone pale. His eyes were locked not on her, but on Luna. Rachel couldn't move. Her heart beat so hard it drowned out the noise of the terminal, the overhead announcements, even the low murmur of conversations around them. Luna, oblivious to the tension, looked up and saw him too. She blinked at Grayson with her bright blue eyes, the same eyes he saw in the mirror every day, and tilted her head with innocent curiosity. She had no idea who he was, but something about his face made her stare a little longer. Grayson took a cautious step forward, as if approaching a dream he didn't want to wake from. "Rachel," he said, his voice hoarse. She hadn't heard that voice in 4 years, and it hit her like a wave. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Luna reached for her hand, sensing the sudden change in her mother's body. Grayson's eyes dropped to the child. His expression shifted, softened, and then crumbled into something like disbelief. "Is she?" he began, but Rachel cut him off. "We're waiting for someone," she said quickly, her voice too sharp, too forced. "It's not a good time." She picked Luna up and started to turn away just as Mark returned. He gave Grayson a quick, suspicious glance and then looked at Rachel. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm but with a thread of threat laced underneath. Rachel didn't answer. She just nodded and walked away, not looking back. Grayson didn't follow. He stood rooted in place, the paper cup in his hand growing cold. He couldn't stop staring at the little girl now walking away in Rachel's arms. He didn't need a paternity test. He knew. Every cell in his body screamed it. That was his daughter. And Rachel hadn't told him. His breath caught in his throat, and a strange, unfamiliar ache filled his chest. For a man who thought he had everything under control, in that moment, Grayson realized he had never been more lost. Grayson didn't sleep that night. He sat in his high-rise apartment overlooking the city skyline, his untouched dinner cold on the counter, his phone in his hand but no idea who to call. All he could see was the little girl's face. Her eyes. His eyes. He kept replaying the moment in the airport over and over, Rachel's stunned expression, the way she had shielded the child so instinctively, and the man who had appeared beside her, his posture, his possessiveness, his presence. Grayson's chest burned with questions he had no right to ask and guilt he hadn't known was still buried that deep. By morning, he had made a decision. He cleared his calendar for the next 3 days, much to the confusion of his assistant, and drove across the city to the only place he could think of, Rachel's last known gallery. He hadn't been there in years, but the owner still remembered her. "She doesn't show work here anymore," the woman said with a note of sympathy, "but she used to rent studio space across town. You might try asking there." With that fragile thread of a lead, Grayson drove aimlessly, his mind split between memories and what-if scenarios. He couldn't understand how she had kept it from him. Had she truly believed he wouldn't care? Or had he given her every reason to think he'd walk away again? By late afternoon, he found himself standing in front of a small brick building with a sign that read Artworks Collective. The place smelled like paint and old wood, the hallway lined with abstract pieces and student work. A young assistant pointed him to the second floor. "Studio 3. She's in today, I think." Grayson climbed the stairs slowly, each step louder in his head than the one before. When he reached the door, he knocked once, softly, then again. No answer. But the door creaked open slightly, and he saw her inside. Rachel was sitting at a work table, her hair tied back, brush in hand, completely absorbed in a canvas. The sight of her, so focused, so familiar, momentarily disarmed him. He hesitated, not wanting to interrupt, but she looked up, and their eyes met again. This time, she didn't flinch. She simply set the brush down and stood. "I shouldn't have come unannounced," he said, voice quiet, apologetic. "But I didn't know how else to reach you." She crossed her arms, not angry, but guarded. "I'm surprised you even tried." He stepped inside slowly. "I need to know the truth, Rachel. Is she mine?" Rachel didn't speak for several seconds. She looked down, exhaled, and then nodded once. "Yes. Her name is Luna. She's 4. Grayson felt the words hit him like a punch to the chest. 4. That meant she had already been pregnant when he left. He sank onto the nearest bench, his hands trembling slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her answer came quickly, but without malice. "Because you left without saying goodbye. Because you made it clear there was no room for me in your world. And I couldn't let my daughter grow up wondering if she was unwanted." He closed his eyes. The shame curled in his stomach like ice. I didn't know. I didn't even give you the chance to tell me. Rachel, I made the worst mistake of my life. There was a long silence between them. Then Rachel stepped forward. She's not a mistake. She's everything. I didn't need your money or your name. I needed peace. And I had to protect that. Grayson looked at her, really looked at her, at the tired lines beneath her eyes, at the strength in her posture, at the quiet fury that came from having survived alone. Can I meet her? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Not to interfere. Just to know her. Rachel hesitated, torn between instinct and possibility. Then she nodded, but her voice was firm. One condition. If you're going to be in her life, it's all or nothing. No disappearing. No broken promises. Grayson met her gaze and, for once, didn't look away. I'm not going anywhere this time. And for the first time since the airport, something in Rachel's face softened. Just a little. Enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the door wasn't fully closed. Grayson spent the next few days preparing himself in ways he never had before. It wasn't about presentations or business deals now. It was about being seen, not as a CEO, not as a man who had once walked away from love, but as a father meeting his daughter for the first time. That idea both terrified and humbled him. He had built companies, negotiated with governments, spoken at global conferences, but nothing had ever made him feel so unsure of his footing as the thought of facing a 4-year-old girl who didn't even know who he was. And yet, despite the fear, he wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything. Rachel kept her word and agreed to meet at a quiet park just outside the city. She chose a place where Luna felt safe, a small grassy space with a wooden playground and a bench shaded by a willow tree. When Grayson arrived, she and Luna were already there. Luna was playing in the sandbox, her back to them, a little sun hat shielding her face, a plastic shovel in one hand and a determined expression on her lips. Rachel stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, a quiet watchfulness in her stance. She gave Grayson a single look that told him this was her world, her rules, and if he so much as faltered, she would shut the door again. He nodded in understanding and approached slowly, his movements careful, not wanting to disrupt the peace. Rachel called Luna's name gently, and the little girl turned, brushing hair from her face. Her eyes locked on Grayson's, and he saw the flicker of recognition again, though she didn't understand why. She tilted her head in that same curious way she had at the airport. Luna, Rachel said, crouching beside her, this is my old friend Grayson. He wanted to meet you. Luna looked at him for a long moment, then blinked and said, hi. Her voice was clear, light, and entirely unafraid. Grayson knelt beside her, suddenly aware of how unimportant his tailored coat or expensive watch was. Hi, Luna, he said softly. That's a beautiful castle you're building. She beamed, the way children do when someone pays attention to their world, and without hesitation, she handed him a second shovel. You can help. Rachel watched from the bench, something caught in her throat as she saw the two of them settle into the rhythm of shared play. Grayson didn't press, didn't try to force connection. He asked about her favorite color, listened as she explained how the princess turtle lived inside the sandcastle, and laughed when she buried his hand under a pile of pebbles. For over an hour, he stayed on her level, patient, curious, open. And Rachel, despite herself, began to hope. Eventually, Luna grew tired and curled up in Rachel's lap with a juice box. Grayson sat nearby, his voice quieter now, his expression serious. She's extraordinary, he said. You've done an incredible job, Rachel. She nodded but didn't respond, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they hadn't said in years. Finally, Grayson spoke again. I know I don't deserve a place in her life. I know I can't erase the past. But I want to try. I want to be here, not just for today, but for everything that comes after. Rachel looked down at Luna, who was now dozing in her arms, her face soft and trusting. "It's not about what I want anymore," she said. "It's about what she needs. If you're going to do this, you do it fully. You don't disappear when it gets complicated. You don't come and go. She's not something you get to sample. She's a whole world." Grayson nodded. "I understand. And I'm ready." He meant it. She could see it in his face. Not the polished mask of a CEO, but the raw, sincere vulnerability of a man who had finally stopped running. She didn't smile. Not yet. But the wall she had built around herself for years finally shifted, if only by an inch. Because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the story she thought had already been written. Maybe, it was the beginning of one they hadn't dared imagine. Grayson began showing up in small, quiet ways, never demanding space but always being present. He asked Rachel for permission before each visit and never questioned her decisions. He arrived early for weekend park outings, brought Luna picture books from his childhood, and learned the names of all her stuffed animals without once glancing at his phone. Luna, cautious at first, began to warm to him with an openness that surprised even Rachel. There was something about the way Grayson listened, how he never dismissed her questions, how he let her talk endlessly about rainbows and dinosaurs and princesses without trying to rush her. He made room for her, not as a distraction from his world but as the center of it. For the first time in years, Rachel felt something shifting, not just in Grayson, but in herself. She watched them together from the kitchen window while they played in the backyard with sidewalk chalk, Luna giggling as she drew crooked suns and stick figures while Grayson knelt beside her, truly engaged. Rachel didn't want to admit it, but the sight of them like that unraveled parts of her she had long buried. She remembered the man she once fell for, the one who had memorized her coffee order and held her hand during her first gallery show, and she wondered if that man had ever truly left or if he had simply been hiding under the weight of ambition and fear. But not everything was simple. Mark hadn't gone quietly. After Rachel asked him to move out, he began calling late at night, showing up unannounced, questioning her judgment and throwing accusations with a venom that made her stomach knot. Rachel did her best to keep Luna sheltered from it, but the tension hung in the air like static. Grayson noticed the change in her posture, the way her eyes darted toward the door whenever a car passed the house. One evening, after a particularly tense phone call that left Rachel visibly shaken, Grayson stayed behind after Luna went to bed. He didn't push her to talk. He simply sat across from her at the kitchen table, his hands folded, his expression calm but serious. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Rachel looked at him for a long moment, something trembling behind her eyes. "I've been doing it alone for so long, I don't know how to let someone help." "You don't have to figure it out tonight," he said gently. "But I'm not going anywhere. And you need to know that." She nodded slowly, the words sinking in deeper than she expected. For the first time since Luna was born, Rachel allowed herself to lean into the quiet strength of another person, even if just for a moment. That night, after Grayson left, she stood in Luna's doorway and watched her sleep. The little girl was curled up with her favorite blanket, her thumb resting near her lips, her expression peaceful. And Rachel realized she wanted that same peace, not just for her daughter, but for herself. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and Grayson settled into an unspoken rhythm. They weren't a couple, but there was an intimacy in their co-parenting that made others assume otherwise. Luna began to refer to him as, "my daddy," without prompting, and when she did, Rachel's breath always caught in her throat. There were moments, small, unassuming ones, when she'd glance at Grayson reading on the couch while Luna climbed over his shoulder, and the idea of a second chance no longer felt impossible. Still, Rachel remained guarded. She needed more than consistency. She needed proof that Grayson understood what it meant to stay, not just physically, but emotionally. She needed to see that he wouldn't run again, no matter how complicated things became. Grayson, to his credit, never asked for more than she was ready to give. He didn't rush. He didn't expect. He just stayed. And little by little, the walls between them began to crumble. Not from grand gestures or declarations of love, but from the daily, ordinary ways Grayson showed he was in this for real. Not just for Luna. But for Rachel, too. It had been almost 3 months since the moment in the park, and in that time, Grayson had become a steady fixture in both Rachel's and Luna's lives. He was there for Saturday morning pancakes, for bedtime stories when Rachel needed to work late, for Luna's first ballet recital where he sat in the front row with his phone held up like a proud father. He helped paint Luna's bedroom in soft lavender and hung up glow-in-the-dark stars just because she asked. More importantly, he never once stepped over boundaries Rachel hadn't offered to move herself. There was a quiet understanding between them now, one built from shared responsibilities, cautious smiles, and a history they no longer avoided but learned to respect. Rachel began to see Grayson differently, not just as a father, but as the man he might have been all along, had he not been afraid. He asked questions about her art, about the years he had missed, about what she needed now. He wasn't trying to fix the past anymore. He was trying to honor it by showing up differently in the present. And Rachel, though still hesitant to label anything, could no longer deny that the air between them had changed. There were looks that lingered a bit longer than they should. There were nights when they'd clean up after dinner in a kind of silent harmony, her hand brushing his arm and neither of them pulling away. One evening, after Luna had fallen asleep watching her favorite movie, Rachel found Grayson standing on the balcony of her apartment, looking out over the city. She brought him a cup of tea and leaned on the railing beside him. The night was quiet, the sky a deep velvet blue, and for a while, neither of them said anything. Then, without turning to face her, Grayson spoke softly. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked away." Rachel's throat tightened, not because it hurt to think about, but because she had thought it 100 times herself. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was calm. "Then Luna wouldn't be Luna. And maybe we wouldn't be here now. I hated you for a long time, Grayson. But I don't anymore. You came back. And you're here." He turned toward her, his expression raw. "I still regret it every day. But I'm trying to be the kind of man she can be proud of. The kind of man you don't have to protect her from." Rachel met his gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. A kind of forgiveness, not declared, but understood. She reached for his hand, just briefly, and he held it as if it were the most fragile thing he'd ever touched. It wasn't a grand declaration, or a sweeping gesture. It was quiet and steady and full of meaning. Later that night, after Grayson had gone, Rachel stood at Luna's door again, watching her daughter sleep with her small hand wrapped around a stuffed bear. And for the first time in years, she let herself imagine a future that wasn't just about survival, but about building something whole. She could see it now. Not just Grayson in Luna's life, but in hers too. Not as a shadow from the past, but as someone who could be part of something new. A partner. A father. Maybe even more. She wasn't ready to say the words yet, but the feeling had rooted itself deep, and it was growing. Not because she needed saving. But because, for the first time, someone had truly shown her what staying looked like. The morning of Luna's 5th birthday was soft and golden, the kind of morning that felt like a gift. Rachel woke up to the sound of tiny feet padding across the hallway and Luna's voice whispering excitedly to herself as she peeked out the window. Rachel smiled to herself before slipping out of bed and making her way to the kitchen where the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls had already started to fill the space. Grayson had arrived early, letting himself in with the spare key Rachel had finally given him the week before, a gesture that had spoken louder than any conversation ever could. He was standing at the stove in jeans and a gray t-shirt, barefoot, humming under his breath as he flipped pancakes and poured warm syrup into a small pitcher. When he saw Rachel enter, his face lit up with that quiet, content expression she had come to look for without realizing it. They moved through the morning like a family that had been doing this for years. Luna tore through wrapping paper with delight, laughing when she saw the art set Grayson had chosen just for her, complete with glitter markers and tiny canvases. Rachel had baked her favorite chocolate cake the night before and decorated it with rainbow sprinkles, and when they sang Happy Birthday, Luna stood in between them, holding both of their hands, her smile so wide it made Rachel's throat tighten. Grayson caught her eyes across the candles and gave her a look that said he felt it too, that in this simple moment, something had healed. Later that afternoon, after the guests had gone and the apartment had quieted again, Rachel sat on the balcony while Luna napped in her room. Grayson joined her with 2 mugs of tea, and they watched the sun sink below the buildings in a wash of warm light. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore, it was full, familiar, almost peaceful. Rachel turned toward him, something unspoken sitting just behind her eyes. "I don't think I ever believed I'd get to have this," she said quietly. "Not just the parenting part, but this peace. This feeling that someone is here and isn't going to leave." Grayson reached over and took her hand, not as a question but as a statement. "I spent years building a life that looked perfect from the outside, but it was hollow. I didn't know what I was missing until I saw Luna. Until I saw you again. Everything that matters to me is right here." Rachel felt something open in her chest that she hadn't let herself touch in a long time. A hope that was no longer fragile but rooted, grounded in something real. She looked at Grayson, not as the man who had broken her heart, but as the one who had worked to mend it, slowly, carefully, piece by piece. "You were wrong about something," she said, a faint smile on her lips. "What's that?" he asked, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You said Luna made you want to be better. But I think you already were. You just didn't know how to let people see it." Grayson didn't respond with words. He leaned in and kissed her, gently, with the kind of certainty that only comes when there's nothing left to prove. It wasn't rushed or hesitant. It was full of everything they'd fought to rebuild. When they pulled apart, Rachel rested her forehead against his and closed her eyes, letting herself feel the weight of the moment. Inside, Luna stirred in her bed, murmuring in her sleep, her dreams quiet and safe. And out on the balcony, with the sun setting and the city beginning to hum, Rachel and Grayson sat together in a peace they had earned, not through perfection, but through forgiveness, patience, and the kind of love that never really leaves, it just waits until both people are ready to find their way back. In my opinion, the ending of this story is not just a resolution, it's a quiet triumph. What began as a painful, unfinished love story evolved into something far more meaningful: growth, redemption, and the choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Grayson's journey wasn't just about reclaiming what he lost, but about earning it through vulnerability and consistency. Rachel, who carried the weight of heartbreak and motherhood with fierce independence, didn't need rescuing, she needed partnership. And Luna, the heart of it all, found herself surrounded by love that was once fractured but finally whole. The beauty of this ending lies in its realism, messy, slow, deeply human, and that's what makes it powerful. It's not a perfect fairy tale, but it's the kind of love story that actually lasts. The gym fell silent as a fair-skinned woman started yelling at a black man near the dumbbells. "Leave. You don't belong here." Her words cut through the air, drawing whispers and tense stares from everyone around. But little did she know, she was speaking to the owner of the gym. Her outburst was just the beginning of a lesson she would never forget. What do you think happened next? Share your guesses in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out the rest of this incredible story. The air in the gym was thick with the sounds of clinking weights, the hum of treadmills, and faint pop music playing in the background. It was an ordinary day, where regulars went about their routines, focused on personal goals and the rhythm of their workouts. The energy was steady, almost meditative, until a sharp, cutting voice shattered the calm. "Hey! What are you doing here?" The voice came from the far end of the gym, near the free weights. Heads turned, curious but cautious, as a fair-skinned woman stood with her hands on her hips, glaring at a black man who had been quietly lifting dumbbells. Her tone was confrontational, her words laced with an undercurrent of disdain that hung in the air like smoke. "You don't belong here," she spat, her voice growing louder with every word. Her body language radiated hostility, from the pointed finger aimed at him to the exaggerated roll of her shoulders, as if her indignation needed to fill the room. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, paused mid-lift, lowering the weights with a calm that contrasted sharply with her anger. He turned to her, his expression measured and composed, though the tension in his jaw hinted at the frustration he was suppressing. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady but firm, the kind of tone that suggested he wasn't unfamiliar with situations like this. The woman scoffed, her laugh sharp and mocking. "Yeah, the problem is you. You shouldn't be here. This place isn't for people like you." A hush fell over the gym. Conversations ceased, machines slowed to a stop, and all eyes turned toward the confrontation. Some gymgoers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Others simply watched, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort, as if they couldn't decide whether to side with the aggressor or the man she was targeting. The man remained still, his gaze unwavering as he studied her. He didn't rise to her bait, didn't meet her anger with his own. Instead, he let the silence stretch, the weight of her words hanging in the air for everyone to hear. "Is that so?" he finally said, his tone calm but edged with a quiet authority. The woman bristled, her cheeks flushing as she realized the growing audience around them. Instead of backing down, she doubled down, her voice rising. "Yes, it is. This is a high-end gym, not some place where anyone can just walk in off the street. So why don't you leave before I call someone to take care of it?" The words were sharp enough to draw gasps from a few onlookers. A man at the squat rack took a step forward, his brows furrowed as if ready to speak, but his companion grabbed his arm, shaking her head. The room remained frozen in a collective silence, the unspoken tension pressing down on everyone. The man she targeted didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his gaze locked onto hers. The calm in his demeanor only seemed to agitate her further, her arms crossing defensively as she leaned back slightly. "Before you do that," he said, his voice firm but never raised, "maybe you should take a moment to think about what you're saying. About who you're talking to." The cryptic nature of his words caught her off guard, and for a fleeting moment, her bravado faltered. But she quickly masked it with another scoff, brushing him off with a wave of her hand. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," she shot back, her tone dripping with condescension. "And I'm telling you to leave. Now." The tension in the room was palpable. It wasn't just a clash of words, it was a battle of dignity against ignorance, of quiet strength against loud prejudice. The woman's arrogance filled the space, but the man's quiet composure held its own weight, commanding respect even from those who had yet to understand the full picture. And yet, she had no idea who he really was. Not yet. But the truth was about to unravel in a way that would leave her, and everyone watching, utterly speechless. The air in the gym grew unnervingly still, as though the confrontation had sucked the energy from the room. The usual background noise of weights clanging and sneakers squeaking against rubber flooring had vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The fair-skinned woman's voice still echoed faintly, its sharpness lingering in the ears of everyone present. People froze mid-motion, their routines forgotten. A man who had been adjusting plates on a barbell paused, his hands resting on the metal. A pair of women near the treadmill slowed their pace, pretending to focus on their screens while stealing glances toward the scene unfolding by the free weights. Even the trainer in the corner, who usually barked encouragement to his clients, stood rooted to the spot, a dumbbell dangling loosely from his hand. The tension was palpable, stretching taut like an invisible wire ready to snap. Some gymgoers averted their eyes, pretending not to notice the brewing conflict. They turned their backs, fiddled with their water bottles, or made a show of checking their phones, desperate to distance themselves from the uncomfortable situation. Others couldn't help but watch, their gazes flickering between the woman and the black man she targeted. Their expressions ranged from discomfort to mild curiosity, as though they were witnessing a spectacle they weren't sure how to process. There were those who silently condemned her actions, their faces tight with disapproval. A middle-aged man near the stationary bikes clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped the handlebars. A younger woman near the stretching area shook her head slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line of quiet disapproval. But none of them moved, their indignation contained within the bounds of their own hesitation. And then there were the passive watchers, their expressions blank or faintly amused. A group of friends near the water cooler exchanged murmured remarks, their smirks betraying a lack of concern. To them, this wasn't an act of injustice, it was entertainment, a brief interruption in the monotony of their workouts. Their laughter, though subdued, felt like a crack in the fragile tension, a reminder of the privilege that allowed them to see the moment as trivial. The fair-skinned woman seemed emboldened by the lack of intervention. Her voice grew louder, her gestures more exaggerated, as though the absence of immediate opposition validated her actions. She shot a glance at the trainer, as if expecting him to step in and back her up, but he remained silent, his eyes darting between her and the man she berated. The black man, however, stood his ground. His posture was calm but unyielding, his hands resting at his sides in a display of quiet strength. He didn't glance at the onlookers, didn't seek their support or acknowledgement. Instead, his focus remained fixed on the woman before him, his gaze steady and unflinching. It was a standoff in the middle of the gym, where the weight of silence spoke louder than words. Each second dragged on, amplifying the discomfort in the room. Those who disapproved silently willed someone, anyone, to intervene, to say something that would break the woman's tirade. But no one moved. No one spoke. The burden of action remained suspended, leaving the man to stand alone against her accusations. For a moment, the woman hesitated, sensing the attention of the room. Her bravado wavered slightly, her gaze flickering toward the onlookers. But instead of retreating, she doubled down, her voice slicing through the silence once more. "Well? What are you waiting for? Leave," she barked, her tone carrying an edge of desperation that betrayed her need to maintain control. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see how the man would respond. He didn't raise his voice or falter under her hostility. Instead, he let the silence stretch, using it as a mirror to reflect her ugliness back at her. His calmness was a stark contrast to her fury, a quiet defiance that carried more weight than any argument. In that moment, the gym wasn't just a place for exercise, it was a microcosm of something larger, a stage where prejudice played out in plain view. The silent stares of the onlookers weren't just passive, they were complicity, a reflection of the bystander effect that so often allowed such moments to escalate unchecked. And yet, beneath the surface, something was beginning to shift. A spark of discomfort, a flicker of realization, was taking hold in those who had remained silent for too long. The black man stood tall, his calm presence in stark contrast to the chaos swirling around him. His dark eyes held the kind of composure that comes from a lifetime of navigating moments like this, moments where restraint became armor, and dignity, a quiet rebellion. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with a deliberate rhythm, before finally speaking. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady and low, cutting through the tense silence of the gym. "I'm not sure why you feel the need to raise your voice, but I'm here to work out, just like everyone else. There's no need for hostility." His words, though measured and calm, seemed to land like a challenge. The woman's face flushed a deeper shade of red, her indignation flaring at his refusal to cower or match her anger. She took a step closer, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if to fortify herself against his unwavering presence. "Don't give me that," she snapped, her voice rising again. "You don't belong here, and you know it. This is a private gym, not some public park where anyone can stroll in." The man tilted his head slightly, a faint frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I don't understand," he said calmly. "What makes you think I don't belong? I have every right to be here, just like you." Her hands flew to her hips, her stance aggressive and unyielding. "Oh, please," she sneered. "You know exactly why. Don't play dumb with me." You think you can just walk in here and do whatever you want? Some of us actually pay to use this place. The gym felt heavier with every word she spoke, her accusations thickening the air like smoke. The onlookers remained frozen, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and disbelief. Some shifted uneasily, glancing at each other as if silently debating whether to intervene. Others stared intently, unable to look away from the unfolding scene. The man didn't flinch. His composure remained intact, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, weariness, perhaps, or the simmering frustration of having to defend his humanity yet again. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firmer now but still calm, "I don't know what assumptions you've made about me, but I assure you, they're wrong. I've done nothing to deserve this treatment." "Assumptions?" she spat, her voice thick with sarcasm. "The only assumption I'm making is that you shouldn't be here. And you're proving me right by refusing to leave." Her words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, daring him to retaliate. But the man refused to rise to her bait. Instead, he squared his shoulders and met her glare head-on, his silence speaking volumes. The intensity of his gaze seemed to unnerve her, if only for a moment, but she quickly masked it with another outburst. "You know what?" she said, pointing a finger at him like an accusation. "I'm going to talk to the management about this. Let's see how long it takes for them to kick you out." He allowed himself a small, sardonic smile, one that barely reached his lips. "If that's what you feel you need to do," he said simply, "then go ahead." The casual confidence in his tone threw her off balance. For the first time, she hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she tried to decipher the meaning behind his words. There was something about the way he carried himself, the quiet strength in his demeanor, that made her pause. But the pause was fleeting. Her pride wouldn't allow her to back down. Instead, she turned on her heel, her head held high, and marched toward the front desk, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The man watched her go, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the rack of weights and continuing his workout as though nothing had happened. Around him, the gym remained suspended in its uneasy silence. Some of the onlookers exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of curiosity and guilt. A few began to shuffle back to their routines, their movements hesitant, as if unsure whether it was appropriate to pretend nothing had happened. But even as the woman disappeared from view, her voice echoing faintly in the distance as she demanded to see the manager, the tension lingered. It was a tension born not just from her words but from the unspoken truths they revealed, truths about prejudice, power, and the quiet battles fought every day by those who refused to be defined by ignorance. The gym was no longer just a place for workouts, it had become a battleground, the tension crackling like static electricity. The fair-skinned woman, still fuming, turned back toward the black man. Her steps were hurried, her face red with indignation, as though she couldn't bear the thought of him continuing his workout unbothered. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. "I'm tired of people like you thinking you can do whatever you want," she spat, her words dripping with venom. "This isn't your space. People pay good money to be here, and you probably just wandered in off the street, didn't you?" Gasps rippled through the room, breaking the suffocating silence that had gripped the onlookers. A few gym-goers exchanged wide-eyed glances, their disbelief etched clearly on their faces. For many, the unspoken racism in her words had crossed a line that even their silence couldn't excuse. The black man, standing tall by the dumbbells, didn't flinch. His hands rested at his sides, his posture calm and unyielding, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. He met her gaze steadily, refusing to let her words diminish him. The dignity in his silence only seemed to fuel her rage further. "What are you even doing here, anyway?" she continued, her voice growing louder, sharper, as if trying to drown out the murmurs around her. "You think you belong in a place like this? You're just making everyone uncomfortable." "That's enough," a voice finally broke in. A middle-aged woman near the treadmill stepped forward, her expression a mix of anger and unease. "You don't speak for everyone here. What you're saying is out of line." The fair-skinned woman turned on her, her face twisted with defiance. "Oh, really? Are you going to tell me you're fine with people like him just strolling in here, taking up space like they own it?" Another gym-goer, a young man by the squat rack, joined in, his voice shaking slightly but firm. "He's not the one making people uncomfortable. Look around. You are." The woman faltered for a split second, her bravado cracking under the weight of the growing opposition. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, her voice rising to a near shout. "Oh, please," she sneered, gesturing toward the black man. "He doesn't belong here. He's probably never even paid for a membership. People like him just take advantage of places like this. And you're all too scared to say it, but you know I'm right." The man finally spoke, his tone calm but firm, cutting through the cacophony. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice steady, each word measured. "You don't know where I come from, what I've done, or what I've earned. You've made assumptions about me based on nothing but the color of my skin. That says a lot more about you than it does about me." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. His words, delivered with such quiet conviction, hung in the air like a challenge. But the woman, unwilling to admit defeat, took another step toward him, her finger jabbing the space between them. "You think you're better than me?" she hissed. "You think your little speech makes you right? Let me tell you something, people like you will never belong here. You'll never belong anywhere." The silence that followed was deafening. The few murmurs that had lingered before had vanished, replaced by an almost tangible sense of disbelief. This wasn't just ignorance or misplaced anger, it was pure, unfiltered prejudice, laid bare for everyone to see. More gym-goers began to step forward, their faces a mixture of anger and discomfort. "You've said enough," one man said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Leave him alone." "Yeah," a young woman added, her arms crossed. "You're embarrassing yourself." But the fair-skinned woman wasn't finished. Her pride had been wounded, and her desperation to regain control of the situation drove her to lash out even further. "You're all so quick to defend him," she snapped, her voice shaking with rage. "But what about the rest of us? What about the people who actually belong here?" The black man, still composed, took a step closer, his presence commanding but never aggressive. His voice was calm, almost soft, but the weight of his words carried a power that no amount of shouting could match. "I do belong here," he said. "And no matter how loud you get or how many insults you throw, that's not going to change." The woman's face flushed, her breath coming in short, angry bursts. For the first time, the realization seemed to dawn on her that the tide of the room had shifted, that she was no longer in control of the narrative. The murmurs of disapproval grew louder, the onlookers' silence transforming into vocal opposition. And yet, as the black man stood his ground with grace and dignity, the woman's pride remained her downfall. She couldn't stop herself, even as the weight of the room turned against her. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The only question left was how far her prejudice would take her, and what consequences she would finally face. The room felt electric, the air heavy with the tension of unspoken truths and exposed prejudices. The black man, standing tall and composed despite the torrent of verbal attacks, took a small but deliberate step forward. The fair-skinned woman, her face red with anger and embarrassment, stared back at him, her arms crossed defensively as though shielding herself from the growing disapproval around her. He paused for a moment, letting the silence settle over the gym. His gaze swept the room, taking in the uneasy faces of the onlookers, some sympathetic, others still frozen in passive observation. Then, in a voice calm yet commanding, he broke the silence. "Ma'am," he began, his tone firm but measured, "I think it's time you knew something. You're standing in my gym." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a moment, the room was completely still, the woman's face a mix of confusion and disbelief. Her defiant expression faltered for just a second before she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand as though brushing away an absurd joke. "Your gym," she repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Don't make me laugh. There's no way you're the owner of this place." The man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his calm demeanor only making her skepticism more pronounced. "That's correct," he said evenly. "I'm the owner of this facility. Every piece of equipment, every square foot of this space, it's all mine." The gasps that followed rippled through the room like a wave. A few gym-goers exchanged wide-eyed glances, while others openly stared at the man, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to realization. The trainer by the dumbbells took a step back, his eyes darting nervously between the man and the woman, as if suddenly regretting his earlier inaction. But the woman wasn't ready to back down. Her pride wouldn't let her. Her laughter was sharp and bitter, cutting through the murmurs of disbelief. "Oh, please," she sneered. "You expect me to believe that? You're just saying that to make yourself look important." The man's face remained calm, but there was a glint in his eyes, something unshakable, a quiet power that commanded attention. "Believe what you want," he said, his voice steady. "But if you'd like proof, I'm happy to provide it." Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a keyring with a single distinct key, a master key. Holding it up for everyone to see, he continued, "This key doesn't just open the front door. It opens every locker, every office, every storage room in this building. Do you want to see for yourself?" The woman's expression froze, her bravado cracking as she processed his words. But instead of conceding, she clung to her disbelief, her voice rising in desperation. "This is ridiculous. You probably stole that key. There's no way someone like you could own a place like this." The murmurs in the room grew louder, shifting from shock to indignation. A young man by the treadmill shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." A woman near the water fountain crossed her arms, her face twisted in disgust at the woman's continued aggression. The man, still composed, took another step forward. His calmness only amplified the weight of his next words. "You've made a lot of assumptions about me today," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "You assumed I didn't belong here. You assumed I couldn't afford to be here. And now, you're assuming I'm lying. But the truth is, this gym exists because of me. I built it from the ground up, and I've worked hard to make it a space where everyone feels welcome, something you've clearly forgotten." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her confidence, once so loud and aggressive, now seemed to falter under the weight of the truth she could no longer deny. Still, her pride wouldn't let her admit defeat. She crossed her arms tighter, her voice dropping to a mutter. This is ridiculous," she mumbled, more to herself than to anyone else. "I don't believe this." The man took a step back, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You don't have to believe me," he said. "But the reality doesn't change just because you refuse to accept it." The gym-goers, once silent spectators, now stood with a newfound energy. Some nodded in support of the man, their expressions filled with a mix of respect and shame for not speaking up sooner. Others openly glared at the woman, their disapproval clear. For the first time, the woman seemed to feel the weight of the room turning against her. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and her face flushed deeper, but her pride kept her rooted in place. She didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge her mistake. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed toward the exit, her footsteps echoing through the suddenly quiet gym. As the door slammed behind her, the man let out a slow, measured breath. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had watched the entire ordeal unfold. "This is why we need to be better," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. But his words carried, and the message was clear: prejudice had no place here, or anywhere. The gym gradually returned to life, the sound of weights and treadmills filling the void left by her absence. But something had changed. The room felt different, warmer, more unified. And at the center of it all stood the man who had quietly, but powerfully, reminded everyone of the strength it took to face hatred with dignity. The door slammed behind her as the woman briefly stepped away, pacing near the front desk, visibly grappling with the weight of what had just been revealed. Her flushed face betrayed a mix of embarrassment and anger, and yet, instead of accepting her mistake, she seemed determined to salvage her pride. When she returned to the center of the gym, her eyes locked on the black man who had quietly asserted his authority as the owner, her demeanor had shifted, not to humility, but to defiance. "Look," she started, her voice louder than necessary, clearly meant to address the audience as much as the man himself. "I didn't mean anything by it. But you have to admit, this whole thing looks suspicious. You were over there, acting like you owned the place. How was I supposed to know you actually did?" Her attempt at justification hung awkwardly in the air, her words doing little to soften the tension. The gym-goers who had been silently watching now exchanged glances, their disbelief only growing. The man stood still, his face calm but firm, his silence inviting her to dig her own hole deeper. "You could have just said something from the start," she continued, her voice growing sharper. "Instead, you stood there, trying to make me look bad. You were provoking me, don't pretend you weren't." At that, a murmur rippled through the room. Several onlookers frowned, shaking their heads. One man near the treadmills muttered, "She's really going there, huh?" The tension that had simmered beneath the surface now bubbled over, her words exposing the deeply ingrained prejudice she had been trying to mask. The man finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Provoking you," he repeated, his eyebrows raising slightly. "By working out in my own gym? By minding my own business?" His words carried the weight of truth, slicing cleanly through her weak defenses. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, her tone hardening. "Don't twist this around. You know exactly what I mean. You were standing there, acting all smug, like you had something to prove. People like you always have something to prove." The room grew deathly quiet. Her words, dripping with condescension, echoed painfully in the ears of those around her. A woman near the free weights audibly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The trainer in the corner froze mid-motion, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. Even the hum of the gym's machines seemed muted, as though the building itself recoiled from the venom in her voice. The man remained composed, though his jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign of the frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "And what exactly do you mean by, people like me?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with an undeniable challenge. For a moment, she hesitated, realizing she had said too much. But instead of retreating, she plunged forward, her pride refusing to let her admit defeat. "You know what I mean," she snapped. "You're not exactly the type of person people expect to see in a place like this. I mean, look around, this is a high-end gym, not some community center." Her words landed like a slap, their racist undertones no longer veiled but glaringly obvious. The silence in the room became suffocating, the discomfort of the onlookers palpable. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others stared at her with open disdain. The man, however, refused to let her bait him. His voice remained calm, though the steel in his tone was unmistakable. "You think this gym is high-end because of the equipment? Because of the people who walk through its doors?" he asked, his gaze steady. "This gym is what it is because of the values it stands for. Values you clearly don't share." She opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand, silencing her with a gesture that was more commanding than any raised voice could be. "Let me make one thing clear," he continued. "You don't get to decide who belongs here. This is my space, built with the idea that everyone, everyone is welcome. If you can't understand that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong." The weight of his words settled over the room, leaving no space for rebuttal. The woman's bravado finally began to crack, her eyes darting around the gym as though searching for an ally. But none came. The onlookers who had once been passive were now actively distancing themselves from her, their expressions ranging from disappointment to outright anger. Realizing she was alone, she let out a huff, her indignation giving way to desperation. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, shaking her head. "I was just trying to keep things in order. If you want to twist it into something else, that's on you." With that, she turned sharply and began walking toward the exit, her retreat far less confident than her initial attack. The door slammed behind her, and the gym seemed to collectively exhale, the tension dissipating like a storm that had finally passed. The man stood quietly for a moment, his gaze fixed on the door. Then, turning back to the room, he addressed the remaining gym-goers. "Thank you for letting me handle that," he said simply. "But silence can be just as loud as words. Remember that next time." His words lingered long after the machines hummed back to life, a reminder that justice wasn't just about standing up, it was about refusing to stay silent. As the door swung shut behind the woman, the tension in the gym didn't dissipate entirely. Instead, it seemed to shift, lingering in the air as people slowly began to process what they had just witnessed. Conversations started quietly at first, whispers exchanged between workout partners, their eyes darting toward the man who had calmly revealed himself as the gym's owner. A few gym-goers approached him hesitantly, their expressions apologetic. One middle-aged woman, clutching a water bottle, was the first to speak. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that," she said, her voice soft but sincere. What she said, it was completely unacceptable. The man nodded in acknowledgement, his calm demeanor still intact. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady. "But it's not the first time I've dealt with something like this. And unfortunately, it probably won't be the last." Her face fell, a mixture of sympathy and shame crossing her features. "Well, you handled it with more grace than most of us could have," she added before stepping back to let others speak. As more people approached, their reactions varied. Some, like the woman, expressed support, praising the man's composure and condemning the woman's behavior. A younger man in a tank top shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and frustration. "I can't believe people still act like that in this day and age," he said, folding his arms. "It's disgusting." But not everyone shared this sentiment openly. A few gym-goers lingered on the sidelines, their conversations hushed but no less telling. "I mean, she had a point," one man muttered to his friend near the water fountain. "He didn't exactly go out of his way to explain himself. Maybe she thought she was just enforcing the rules." His friend glanced around nervously before replying, "Yeah, but there's a way to do that without, saying the stuff she said." "She was just frustrated," the man countered with a shrug. "People blow things out of proportion all the time." These quieter exchanges revealed an uncomfortable truth: while the woman's actions had been overt, the biases that fueled them weren't isolated to her alone. Some of the onlookers, even those who hadn't spoken up during the confrontation, seemed to grapple with their own assumptions, questioning whether their silence had been complicit or protective. At the front desk, the receptionist looked visibly shaken, nervously tapping her pen against the counter. When a coworker asked if she was okay, she hesitated before replying, "I didn't know he was the owner. I mean, he's always been quiet, keeps to himself. I just assumed." Her voice trailed off, and she flushed with embarrassment, realizing how similar her assumptions were to the ones the woman had weaponized. Meanwhile, in the corner of the gym, a small group of regulars huddled together, their voices low but their tone unmistakably defensive. "Look, I'm not saying she was right," one of them said, a middle-aged man with a towel slung over his shoulder. "But if he's the owner, shouldn't he be more, visible? It's not like we'd have known." Another nodded in agreement. "Exactly. She handled it badly, sure, but it's not like she was completely out of line to think something was off." Their words, though quieter than the woman's outburst, carried the same weight of prejudice, masked in rationality, wrapped in excuses. They didn't overtly condone her behavior, but their subtle defense of it revealed just how deeply ingrained these biases were. The man, standing near the free weights, was acutely aware of these murmurs. He could feel the mix of support and resistance in the room, the subtle currents of prejudice that persisted even in the aftermath of such an overt display. But he didn't let it shake him. Instead, he chose to focus on the positive, the handful of gym-goers who had spoken up, the ones who now approached him with apologies or words of encouragement. A young woman with earbuds hanging around her neck stepped forward hesitantly. "I just wanted to say. I should have said something earlier," she admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. "I saw what was happening, and I just froze. I didn't know what to do." The man looked at her, his expression softening. "It's not easy to speak up," he said. "But recognizing that is the first step. Next time, you'll know what to do." She nodded, a small smile breaking through her nervousness. "Thank you for how you handled everything." As the conversations continued, the atmosphere in the gym began to shift again. The weight of the confrontation didn't disappear entirely, but it evolved into something more reflective, a moment of reckoning, both for those who had witnessed it and for the man at its center. He glanced around the room, noting the range of reactions. Some faces were open, supportive, others were closed off, defensive. But one thing was clear: the confrontation had sparked something deeper, a discussion that extended beyond the gym walls. It wasn't just about one woman's actions, it was about the attitudes and assumptions that had allowed her to feel justified in the first place. And while the man knew he couldn't change every mind in that moment, he also knew that change often started with a single spark. Today, he had been that spark. And as he returned to his workout, the hum of the gym slowly resuming around him, he allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was a path he was more than ready to walk. The gym had fallen into an uneasy rhythm, the buzz of muted conversations and the hum of machines trying to mask the tension that still lingered in the air. The fair-skinned woman stood frozen near the dumbbells, her flushed face a vivid contrast to the calm, steady demeanor of the black man before her. Her shoulders were squared, but the defiance in her posture was beginning to crack under the weight of the silence that had replaced the chaos of her outburst. The man, standing tall and resolute, took a step forward, his gaze unflinching as it met hers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but devoid of anger, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Her eyes widened in disbelief, the simple command catching her off guard. "What?" she snapped, her voice sharp but trembling. "You can't just." "Yes," he interrupted, his tone unwavering. "I can. This is my gym, and your behavior today is unacceptable. We have a zero-tolerance policy for harassment, and that includes what you've just displayed here." For a moment, she stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words to claw back her sense of control. The onlookers, who had been mere spectators moments ago, were now quietly shifting closer, their collective presence an unspoken judgment. "You think you can just kick me out?" she finally spat, her voice loud and brittle. "I'm a paying member. I have every right to be here." The man didn't flinch. "And as the owner, I have every right to revoke your membership," he replied evenly. "You've made it clear through your actions and words that you don't respect the values this gym was built on. This is a place for everyone, and you've chosen to undermine that." Her cheeks flushed an even deeper red, a mixture of anger and humiliation creeping into her expression. She glanced around the room, as though hoping to find allies among the crowd, but the faces staring back at her were filled with disapproval, or worse, indifference. The realization hit her like a slap: no one was going to come to her defense. Her bravado began to crumble, and she let out a bitter laugh, more a reflex than an actual show of amusement. "Fine," she said, throwing up her hands. "If that's how you want it, I'll leave. But don't think for a second that this is over. You'll hear from my lawyer." The threat hung in the air for a moment, but it was clear from the slight tremor in her voice that she didn't believe it herself. The man simply nodded, unfazed. "You're free to do what you feel is necessary," he said. "But for now, I need you to leave." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the exit, as though weighing her options. With a huff, she turned on her heel, her steps brisk and angry as she made her way toward the door. The sound of her sneakers scuffing against the floor echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet room. As she reached the exit, she paused, casting one last glance over her shoulder. Her expression was a volatile mix of resentment and shame, her eyes darting from the man to the crowd that still watched her every move. "This place isn't as great as you think it is," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else, before shoving the door open and disappearing into the daylight. The room remained still for a beat after she left, the collective breath of the gym-goers held as though waiting for some invisible signal. Then, slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, the clinking of weights and the hum of treadmills gradually filling the silence she had left behind. The man exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade. He turned back to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had witnessed everything. "Thank you for your patience," he said simply, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "And thank you to those who chose to speak up." A few heads nodded in acknowledgement, and a couple of people even offered him murmured words of support as they passed by. But the lesson of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. The woman's departure wasn't just about removing a source of conflict, it was a reminder of the consequences of unchecked prejudice and the power of standing firm in the face of it. As the man returned to his workout, the gym began to feel different, lighter, perhaps, but also more aware. Though the confrontation had ended, its impact lingered, a quiet testament to the values the gym was built on and the unwavering resolve of its owner. The woman's chest rose and fell quickly, her breathing ragged with a mix of anger and disbelief. She stood rooted to the spot, her face still red from the confrontation. The gym had fallen into an almost eerie silence again, all eyes fixed on her as the black man, the owner of the gym, took a measured step forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm yet unyielding, cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's time for you to leave." His words hung in the air, their finality unmistakable. There was no room for negotiation, no opening for another tirade. The woman's mouth opened as if to protest, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But the onlookers had long since turned from passive spectators to silent judges, their faces filled with a mixture of disappointment, disdain, and quiet satisfaction. She let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking her head as though she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're kicking me out?" she spat, her voice trembling with indignation. "For what? For standing up for this place. For trying to keep it respectable." The man's expression didn't waver. His calmness only seemed to amplify the weight of his authority. "You're not standing up for this place," he replied, his tone even but firm. "You're standing up for your own prejudice. And that has no place here." The room collectively held its breath. The woman's jaw tightened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "You can't do this," she said, though the words sounded more like a plea than a command. "You can't just kick me out." "Yes, I can," he said simply, gesturing toward the gym's front door. "This is my gym. And you've made it very clear that you don't respect what it stands for. I won't tolerate that, not for my staff, not for my members, and certainly not for myself." Her face twisted, caught somewhere between outrage and humiliation. The reality of the situation was sinking in, and it was clear she had no rebuttal left. But rather than admit defeat, she clung to her pride like a shield, her eyes narrowing into a glare. "You think this makes you better than me?" she snapped. "You think kicking me out proves something?" The man didn't flinch. "This isn't about proving anything," he said. "It's about accountability. Actions have consequences. And today, you're facing yours." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, subtle nods of agreement, whispers of approval. The woman glanced around again, hoping to find a lifeline, but the crowd's silence spoke volumes. No one was on her side anymore, if they ever had been. Realizing there was no way out, she let out a sharp breath and turned toward the exit. Her steps were quick and forceful, the heels of her sneakers slapping against the polished floor. But as she neared the door, she paused, turning back to face the man one last time. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this." The man held her gaze, unshaken. "Goodbye," he said firmly, his tone carrying the weight of finality. With that, the woman pushed the door open and stepped outside, the sound of the door slamming behind her echoing through the gym. For a moment, no one moved, the tension still lingering like a shadow in the now quiet space. Then, slowly, the room came back to life. The hum of treadmills resumed, weights clinked softly as they were lifted and lowered, and low murmurs filled the air as people returned to their routines. But the energy had shifted. There was a sense of resolution, a quiet acknowledgement that something important had just happened. The man stood for a moment longer, his shoulders straight and his gaze steady as he watched the door she had just exited through. Though her departure had been humiliating for her, he knew it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone in that room, about showing them that prejudice, no matter how loud or insistent, had no place in his gym or his life. As he turned back toward the free weights, a few gym-goers approached him hesitantly. "Thank you," one of them said softly. "For saying what needed to be said." He nodded, offering a small, tired smile. "We all have to do our part," he replied simply before returning to his workout. The woman was gone, but the lesson she left behind remained, etched into the memory of everyone who had witnessed the scene. And though her anger had turned to shame as she walked out the door, the man knew that the fight against prejudice wasn't over, not for her, and not for the world outside those gym walls. As the door slammed shut behind the woman, a heavy stillness lingered in the gym for a moment, as if the building itself was exhaling after the tension that had hung so thick in the air. The rhythmic hum of treadmills and the clinking of weights slowly returned, but the atmosphere felt undeniably different. The energy in the room was lighter, more open, yet tinged with a quiet introspection that hadn't been there before. The man, still standing by the free weights, took a slow breath, his calm demeanor intact but his expression reflecting the emotional toll of the confrontation. He didn't move right away, allowing the moment to settle, his gaze sweeping over the room. For a brief moment, he thought everyone would simply return to their routines, pretending as if nothing had happened. But then, one by one, people began to approach him. A young woman with earbuds dangling from her neck was the first to step forward. She hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other before finally speaking. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but genuine. "I should have spoken up earlier. I saw what was happening, and I just froze." The man turned to her, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but kind. "It's not easy to step into a situation like that. The fact that you're here now means a lot." Encouraged by her gesture, others began to follow. A middle-aged man, still holding a water bottle, approached next. It was uncomfortable to watch, he admitted, his face flushed with guilt. "But I just want to say, the way you handled it, it was admirable. You've got a lot more patience than I would have had." The man nodded, offering a small smile. "Patience comes with practice," he said, a touch of humor in his tone. "Unfortunately, this isn't the first time I've had to deal with something like this." The honesty in his words struck a chord with the crowd. People who had been hesitant before now felt compelled to speak. A trainer, who had been frozen in the corner during the confrontation, approached with an apologetic expression. "I should have stepped in sooner," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought it wasn't my place, but I see now that staying silent was just as bad." "It's never easy to know what to do in the moment," the man replied. "But recognizing it now means you'll be ready next time." The trainer nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly as if a weight had been lifted. Around them, more conversations began to spark. People exchanged glances, their murmurs reflecting a shared sense of accountability. For some, it was the first time they truly grappled with the implications of their silence. For others, it was an opportunity to reflect on their own assumptions and biases. A pair of gym-goers near the water fountain spoke quietly, their tones filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "I can't believe we just stood there," one of them said, shaking her head. "Why didn't we say anything?" "I think we were all caught off guard," her friend replied. "But we can't let that be an excuse next time." The man couldn't help but notice the shift. The once stiff silence of the gym had given way to an atmosphere of self-awareness and growth. The confrontation, though uncomfortable, had sparked something deeper, a collective reckoning with the unspoken norms that allowed prejudice to fester in the first place. Toward the back of the room, an older woman with a kind face approached him cautiously. "I've been coming here for years," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "And I've seen things I should have spoken up about. But I didn't. I think it's time I changed that." Her words resonated with everyone nearby. The man placed a reassuring hand over his heart and nodded. "It's never too late to start," he said warmly. "Change begins with recognizing what we can do better." As the conversations continued, the gym felt less like a place of confrontation and more like a space for growth. The man's quiet strength had set an example, inspiring those around him to confront their own silence and take responsibility for fostering a more inclusive environment. By the end of the day, the gym felt transformed, not in a grand, sweeping way, but in the small, meaningful interactions that hinted at a lasting change. People who had once avoided eye contact now nodded in acknowledgement. Strangers struck up conversations that extended beyond their workouts. The space felt more connected, more human. The man returned to his routine, his movements deliberate and focused. But as he lifted the weights, he couldn't ignore the sense of hope that had settled in his chest. This moment, however painful, had been a turning point, not just for the gym, but for everyone in it. And though the work of dismantling prejudice was far from over, he felt confident that they had taken a step in the right direction. The story of the confrontation in the gym didn't stay confined to its four walls. By the end of the week, the incident had made its way through word of mouth, social media, and local news. A video, discreetly recorded by one of the gym-goers, began circulating online. The clip captured the woman's heated tirade, her blatant prejudice, and the man's composed yet firm response. The footage struck a chord with viewers, sparking a wave of reactions. Some were outraged by the woman's behavior, while others were inspired by the man's quiet strength. The comment sections filled with debates about privilege, racism, and the power of accountability. People shared their own stories of injustice, and the video became a rallying cry for change. For the man, the attention was both unexpected and overwhelming. His inbox flooded with messages, some supportive, others critical. News outlets reached out for interviews, eager to spotlight his story. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he wanted the moment to define him or his gym. But as the days passed, he realized the opportunity before him. This wasn't just a chance to tell his story, it was a chance to inspire change. During an interview with a local news station, he spoke candidly about the incident. "This isn't about one person," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's about the larger issue of how we treat each other, how we let our assumptions dictate our actions. What happened in my gym isn't unique. But it's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to do better." His words resonated far beyond his local community. Other gym owners reached out, asking how they could implement similar zero-tolerance policies for discrimination. Activists praised him for turning a painful experience into a platform for education and advocacy. Slowly but surely, his gym became a symbol of what was possible when values of equality and respect were upheld. Within the gym itself, the atmosphere transformed. The man implemented new initiatives, including diversity training for staff and members, and created spaces for open dialogue. He invited speakers from different backgrounds to share their experiences, fostering a sense of community and understanding. The gym, once just a place for physical strength, now became a haven for emotional and social growth as well. Meanwhile, the woman who had sparked the incident found herself at the center of public scrutiny. Her name and face were now widely recognized, and the backlash was swift. Friends distanced themselves, and she lost opportunities at work due to the attention her behavior had garnered. She issued a statement attempting to explain her actions, but it was clear that the damage to her reputation was done. For many, she became a cautionary tale, a stark example of how prejudice could lead to personal and public disgrace. While some felt pity for her, others saw her downfall as a necessary lesson in accountability. What mattered most, though, was that her actions had brought a much-needed conversation to the forefront. As the weeks turned into months, the man continued his mission to make the gym a beacon of inclusivity. Members noticed the difference, strangers greeted each other more often, and the unspoken tension that had once lingered in the air was gone. The man knew there was still work to be done, but he also knew they were on the right path. Standing in the center of the gym one evening, he watched as people of all backgrounds worked out side by side, their laughter and conversation filling the space. It was a simple moment, but it spoke volumes about the progress they'd made. He smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just a gym anymore, it was a community built on mutual respect and understanding. What do you think about this story? Has it inspired you to reflect or take action in your own life? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep spreading positivity and change.